Okay, everyone, welcome. Shabbat Shalom. I hope everybody's doing well in spite of all the things that are going on. Everyone is cozy in their homes and enjoying this time that we should take advantage of being with family, of sharing with them. Most of the time we're either out working or doing stuff, but this is a good time to spend with family, at least family at home, and to take opportunity to study together the word, to pray together, and to lift praises to the Lord that in spite of all things that are happening, we're still alive, we're still standing. The Lord has not failed us, so we're grateful for that. And again, welcome to everyone that's here this afternoon. So today, the Torah portion is called Tzav, and let me share the screen so I can show you the portions, the verses, the chapters that we're studying today. So today's Torah portion, like I said, is called Tzav, which is translated as command, and it is found in the book of Leviticus, chapter 6, verse 8 through chapter 8, verse 36. Today also is what's called Shabbat Hagadol, which means the great Sabbath, or just the great, because it's the Sabbath right before Passover. And the portion related to that is found in Malachi, chapter 3, verse 4 through chapter 4, verse 6. And in terms of the apostolic writings, it's Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11 through verse 28, of which in prior teachings we have talked about that. Now, before we go directly to the Torah portion itself, I want to go over something about the temple in relationship to Yeshua. And the question is, my question to you, of course, you don't have to answer literally, but the question is, did Yeshua observe and respect all the commandments and all the protocol of the temple? And we're going to see that being who he was, a Jewish man born in Israel, of Jewish parents, and the temple was standing when he was living in Jerusalem. Most likely, I'd say 100% for sure that he did follow the protocol of the temple. Now, again, I know that for some people, the book of Leviticus is not something they care too much for because of the offerings and the animals and whatever, but we have to put that aside and understand that the book of Leviticus is a book that teaches us holiness, that teaches us how to approach a holy God, because this is what he has commanded. And so the purpose of Leviticus is to teach us how to relate to the Lord and also to the community, to the other people around us. And so what we're seeing here in this PowerPoint is a diagram of how the temple in the second temple in the first century looked like. And one of the things that we have to notice is that this is the entrance, the main entrance, and of course this is in the east. And around here there's a small, there was a wall that was not too high, but big enough that people could not miss it. And this wall is called the Soreg. And this wall had some signs around it in different languages, letting know that no Gentiles were allowed to go through this wall, this entrance into the temple. No one that was circumcised, any male that was not circumcised, could not go into the temple per se. They could not cross this entrance. And they had guards, Levitical guards, that were watching to make sure that the people that came in were absolutely Jews, and they were either converts, and make sure that they were following the laws of protocol in entering the temple. So again, this is the east, one of the east entrances. And these buildings that are here, they represent, they were for different things. For example, this one here, they kept the oil. This one here was where people that did the vow, the Nazarite vow, would come to do their offerings once the vow was finished. This one was the chamber for the lepers that had been healed would come here to do their offerings to be integrated again into the community. And this one is where they had wood. They would have wood for the altar. They would have all their wood saved there. These smaller ones, this one, which was right at the entrance, was for the ashes of the red heifer. They were saved there, stored there. And this was part of the Sanhedrin. This was called the Katan, which was a smaller group of judges that were here in this area. This is another diagram to see the whole temple, because what we were looking at first was at this area. Now this area is was for the women. This is what's called the court of the women. And this is the area that most likely Yeshua spent most of his time. Why? Because in this area that was called the court of the women, women, children, and men were allowed. Of course, all of them Jewish or converts. No Gentiles were allowed in this area. Like here we can see better what's called the soreg, which is that wall that separated the Gentiles from the Jews. So when Paul is talking about the partition of separation between Gentiles and Jews, is this one. It's the soreg. Because outside here, you could have Gentiles dealing, and sometimes they were allowed to bring offerings, but they could not cross into this area. They could not cross the soreg. So most likely Yeshua spent most of his time here teaching. And then we have here what's called, what's going to be the main entrance into the sanctuary per se, which is the most holy area within the temple complex. And this here is going to be the Nicanor gate. And we'll see a better picture of that. And at this area, the only other people that could cross through this Nicanor gate into this area here was the Israelites, the men that were chosen to be part of the morning prayers, the men that represented their provinces. They would come on a weekly basis for a week, and they would do the standing prayer or the Amidah in the morning in this area. And after the Israelites, you had an area where the Levites could stand and could minister. But other than that, you could not pass into this area where the altar was except for the priests. From this border all the way to the main sanctuary itself were only priests allowed, no one else. And all this is due not to social classes, but to grades of holiness. And here we have that this is the east entrance. Here is the north. And once they came in here, only the priests. Here we have the altar. The ramp always was towards the south. And the offerings, the animals were slaughtered in this area, which is the north area. And here we have 4 other buildings. These buildings were huge. There were other chambers for other things. There were places for the priests and Levites to sleep. They had a place to eat. Part of the large Sanhedrin was in one of these buildings, which right now I don't remember which one it was. I'll have to go back and study those and memorize those. But all these buildings were huge, and they had many chambers for many different things, where they stored the instruments, where they stored other things, the money for the offering. So there was a lot of things that they used these buildings for. So this is another diagram to show again the same thing. This is the east entrance. This is the women's court. These are the 4 chambers at the entrance. And here is the stairs. There's 15 steps that go up into what's called the Nicanor gate. And these 15 steps is where the Levites would stand to sing the Psalms of either the week or the Psalms of Ascent. And remember that the number 15 has to do with worship. Why? Because remember, this is a mountain, and so we're going from the lowest point of the mountain to the highest point of the mountain, which is where the sanctuary, the temple per se, was standing. And so these steps, there's elevation. Of course, when you're looking at it this way, you can't see it, but there's elevation because there's steps going into this east entrance and more steps going into the court of the women, then steps going into the outer court, and then steps going into the sanctuary itself. Why? Because we're always going up towards the Lord. That's why you always say you're always going up towards Jerusalem. And here again, we see the northern area where they slaughtered the animals, the altar with the ramp always to the south. Here they have the copper laver, which is, this diagram is incorrect. This was inside one of the buildings that was here outside that we saw in the other diagram. And this is what's called the ulam, which is kind of like a foyer before going into the holy place and then the Holy of Holies. And all these little boxes here represent rooms or chambers that had many functions associated with the priest. Again, so this is, it says here, the court of Israel, which means the Israelites, the men that were invited to be part of the Amidah, could stand here, and then the Levites, and then the priest. So all these had their grade of holiness, divisions, and no one could pass beyond the division that it corresponded to that person or to those individuals. Now, Yeshua, before he could go into the temple per se, here, before he could go into the court of the women to teach or to pray or to be with the disciples, any person before entering this area through the east entrance, remember this is the main one, but the one that leads to the court of the women, everyone had to do a mikvah. You just could not walk in. Everyone had to do a mikvah. So therefore, it has been found in archaeologies what would be the south side of where the temple stood. Now here we have part of the Dome of the Rock, which where the original temple was, the first and the second temple of Israel were standing there instead of this abomination that exists right now. So this is the south side, which is this side. Okay, so beyond this soreg, there's like a court here, an area, and then beyond that area, there's that wall, which is the southern wall. It's a retaining wall. And they have discovered here is what's part of the mikvaot, or ritual bath. And all these ritual bath, here is a closer view of it. As you can see through archaeology, they have found all these baths, and these are ritual bath or mikvaot, where people would come and do a mikvah before going up. Here are the stairs before going up into the temple per se, into the court of the women, for example. Because no one could enter without having gone through a mikvah. Why? Because it's part of their purification rituals. Because you don't present you have to present yourself to the Lord in the most pure manner, and most clean manner, and to take away all the contaminants associated with daily life and daily work and all the things that had mundane things. So everyone had to do a mikvah. And one of the things, if you remember reading in the Gospels, there was a time when Yeshua touched a leper. Remember the leper that he healed? He touched him. Because remember that Yeshua was very compassionate. And so this leper most likely had been touched by any person in who knows how many years, because anyone that touched a leper became contaminated. Because remember that the leper represents death. It represents the walking dead. So, and death is the greatest grade of uncleanliness. So when Yeshua touched this individual, he became ritually unclean. He did not sin. A ritual impurity is not sin. A ritual impurity is not sin. It just makes you impure to go and do the rituals or participate in any of the rituals of the temple. So when Yeshua touched this leper, he became ritually impure, which means that after dealing with this individual, he had to come and do a mikvah if he wanted to enter the temple again, or the court of the women. And even though the Gospels don't say that he took a mikvah, remember that the writers of these Gospels understood that their audience knew these things. The audience was aware of all the rituals that had to do with purification. And so they knew that anyone that touched a leper had to have a mikvah, or anyone that dealt with ritual impurity had to go through a mikvah. So we know that Yeshua probably in one of these did a mikvah. And it has been documented that at least 700 mikvaot have been found all through Jerusalem, or path leading to Jerusalem. Why? Because every time there was a festival that required the presence of the community, everyone had to go through a ritual bath or mikvah. And because women and men had to be separated, there were mikvahot for women and mikvahot for men. And not only that, you have to remember that every time a mikvah was done, it was completely without any clothing. You went in naked and you came out, and of course you dressed yourself and then you came out. It was very private. Even today in synagogues today, for example, synagogues in Israel and synagogues in the United States, they have their own mikvah. And the thing about a mikvah is that there has to be with living waters. It cannot be stagnant waters. And mikvahot that do exist in for example, in the States, it's rainwater that they keep collecting, and it's completely being renewed all the time. So it has to be living waters. You can use a river, you can use a stream, you can use fresh water. Anywhere there's fresh water that you can immerse completely, because a mikvah involves that you completely immerse yourself. Not even one hair can be left out without going through the waters. So most likely, definitely, Yeshua did his mikvah every time he went to the temple court. And remember that a ritual impurity is not a sin. We know that Yeshua never sinned, but he did become ritually impure, unclean. Why? Because he dealt with prostitutes. He dealt with the people that the Pharisees and Sadducees didn't want to deal with. So that to them, he dealt with Gentiles. He dealt with other people. So they considered him to be ritually impure. So he had to go through mikvahot. And so once he did a mikvah to come into the court of the women, this is a closer view. What we have here again is the 15 steps that lead to the Nicanor gate. This is called the Nicanor gate, which is the main entrance, eastern entrance into the temple per se, the sanctuary per se. And here we have these columns. So these are areas, and this here was huge. Here we have balconies. Remember that the women were separated from the men, and there were balconies, and the women, this is where they stood, or during any ceremony, any ritual, any festivities that were being done in here in the court. These columns were so big that the commentaries say that it took 3 men with their arms outstretched to be able to go around one of these columns. So they're huge. 3 men with their arms extended could go around one of these columns. And so here, like I said, the 15 steps, the Nicanor gate, and this is where most of the people assembled. Because remember that beyond this point, no one could enter unless you were one of the Israelites invited to do the Amidah in the morning during that week. And so each man represented one of their provinces. Maybe Yeshua, who knows, he probably maybe once participated in doing these prayers, but beyond that point of where the Israelite men stood, he could not go beyond that in spite of who he was. Because remember, Yeshua was not a Levite, and he was not a priest, descendant of Aaron. And what I want to show here is, see this entrance here, which is the eastern entrance to the tabernacle, is this entrance now. In the temple, the Nicanor gate is this entrance. Okay, and in last Torah, the last Torah portion, or I think it was the one prior to that, where we had that it mentions that the women were standing in front of the eastern entrance to the tabernacle. This is what's going to be the court of the women when the temple is built. Again, this is what in the temple was the Nicanor gate, the eastern entrance to the tabernacle. And here what I'm trying to show you is the entrances or the gates into the temple or the sanctuary. Remember, this is the part that here's the Nicanor gate. So this is where the court of the women is. You cross the Nicanor gate and then you come to the holy area or the place of the temple per se. And these are the 4 buildings, the corner buildings that we saw in the other diagrams. And this is to show you that there were 13 gates entrances into this area. And even though the Bible does not mention in the tabernacle, going back to the tabernacle, that it doesn't mention, it only mentions the eastern gate, we know that there had to be other 13, there had to be at least other 12 entrances into the tabernacle area. Why? because the pattern never changes. And so if the first temple had 13 gates, the second temple had 13 gates, and even in the, when you read Ezekiel talks about these gates, that means that the tabernacle had to have them, because you can never ever change the pattern, the tavnit that God gave in reference to his temple, to his house, to his sacred space. And if you count them, you're going to count 10. But here, these two are also counted as gates, and these are the gates that had to do, they were called wickets, which were entrances. Remember that when we looked at the Nicanor gate, let me see if I can, it's these two entrances. These two entrances are part of the gates that make up the 13. So all these are for a reason. And all these buildings also had their functions and their purposes, which maybe someday we'll go over all those. And what I like to show you here is the altar. Here's the altar. Again, this is the northern side. This is south, this is west, and this is east. So this is the Nicanor gate. And so here where we see this beautiful tile here in the bottom, this is where the Israelite men could stand to recite the Amidah, along with the Levites and the priests. And then we have a place where the Levites could do their functions, but they could never cross from there to here. This is the area that belonged to the priest, what's called the outer court, or the altar was from that point on. It's the area of the priest. Why? Again, it has to do with grades of holiness. Remember that Israel was holy, but the Levites had a higher grade of holiness, and within the Levites, the priest had a higher grade of holiness, and within the priest, the person in Israel that had the greatest grade of holiness was the high priest. And what we're seeing here is the different piles of wood for the fires that were on the altar. And this is the veil to the entrance of the holy place. Of course, in this diagram, we don't see it, but this thing is like 8 stories high. So that's why when Yeshua was crucified on the Mount of Olives, which I believe was in the Mount of Olives, which is completely all the way east, all the way outside the city on the Mount of Olives, the centurion could see when this veil ripped, because it ripped from the top to the bottom. And this thing was at least like 8 stories high. So this was a huge, huge veil that was covering the entrance of the holy place. And these, again, steps. And all these steps, there's a specific number of steps. And again, every step has to do with the psalms that were sung, and it has to do with the way you approach the king. Because as you come closer to the holy place and then the Holy of Holies, you always go higher and higher. Why? Because the purpose of God is always to elevate us in his presence. And this is to show you that what we're seeing here, the altar and the laver, it's this in the temple. Here's the altar. Now the laver was inside one of these buildings, because here the laver is outside. And here we have what the veil we were just discussing is this area. This is the entrance to the holy place. We have the laver, we have the altar. And here what I'm showing is, again, something that I wanted to mention. This is the northern side where the animals were slaughtered. Now, somewhere within this area, there was a place where the king, a descendant of David, could sit. Remember that the only person that could sit in the temple was a descendant of David, the king. No one else could sit. All the ceremonies, all the rituals, everything that was done, everybody had to go through them standing. No one could sit, with exception the king of Israel, or descendant of David. And somewhere in this northern atrium, they had a place for the king to sit. So giving you some perspective, this is the north side, and this is going towards the south. But here is part of the altar. This is, again, the area where they would slaughter the animals. So somewhere here, the king could sit. No one else could sit except the king. And so what we're showing here, this is a marker. And let me get the name of that, because I keep forgetting. It's this marker here is called the Rishai Pispesin. Rishai Pispesin. And this was a marker to designate areas of higher grade of holiness. What do I mean by that? Remember that there was a part here in front of the altar where the Levites could minister and could stand and could be there. So beyond this red line or this marker, the Levites could not go into this area. Why? Because this pertained to the priest and it had a higher grade of holiness. Anyone that went beyond this, the Torah says that they would die. They would go through what's called karet, which means a judgment from God, and many interpret it as being a premature death. So everywhere there were markers, so the Levites would know where they could go and where they could not go. The same thing inside the buildings, there were markers. Some of these buildings, for example, there was a building that had allowed women to come into the building. They're coming from the outside into the building, and they would stand at the door of this building. For example, they were bringing an offering. Remember, there were some offerings where they had to lay their hands on the animal. So the woman would stand here with her offering, lay her hands on the animal, and give it to the priest. He's the only one that can stand here. The priest would take the animal and have it slaughtered on the altar. But she could not pass. No one that was not a priest could pass from these doors into this area. So there were markers all over the place, so they knew, especially if a person became unclean, even if a priest became unclean, and there was a marker, that individual could not pass beyond that marker. Why? Because they would be what's called ma'al. They would be fulfilling something called ma'al, which is a legal offense against God and his holy things, his kedusha, his sacred space. So Yeshua could never ever, being who he was, go beyond the Nicanor gate from the area where only Israeli men could stand, or beyond any place here in the altar or where the priests were. Why? Because he was not a Levite, he was not a priest. So Yeshua did follow completely all the protocol of the house of his father. That is why when he got mad with the people that were selling, they were corrupt and they were stealing from the people, he did what he did. Now this is an aerial view of what the mountain, the Temple Mount, looks like today. And just to give you a perspective, here where I have this marking, this here is what's called the Kotel, or the Western Wall. This is where people come to the Western Wall. Now the Western Wall was part of the retaining walls around the temple. This is the area of the temple per se, what's called the 500 by 500. This area here were extensions done by the Hasmoneans, by Herod, and some other person right now, I can't remember. The Persians, I think the Persians, the Herodians, and Hasmoneans. So what Herod did was he added around this area. Now this area here, the 500 by 500, that cannot be changed. That always has to be exactly the same, no matter if tabernacle, first temple, second temple, third temple, no matter what, it always has to have the same tavnit, the same pattern. So Herod and some other kings built around it, especially Herod was the one that extended the most the Temple Mount. And so these things here are retaining walls. And this is the Western Wall where people meet. This is the Kotel, or the plaza. Here is the area where you go into what's called the Rabbi's Tunnel, which means that when you go in through these tunnels, you go underground and you go through what would be the Western Wall. And remember, if this is the West, where unfortunately this abomination is where the Holy of Holies was. So when you go down through the tunnels and walk, and you get to a point here, this is the closest anyone can be to what was the original Holy of Holies, the western side. Okay, so remember, this wall is not part of this, which is the main part of the temple. This was a retaining wall. And this is just to show you how it looks now today. So when Yeshua was dealing with the merchants, it was not in this area. It was outside this area, because this area is holy. So it was where they had all those other buildings, all those other areas where people could do, they could meet, they could pray together, they could talk, whatever they did. They could do the sale of the animals, the change of the money, but it was never done within the most holy parts of the sanctuary. This is what I was trying to show you. Again, just to give some perspective, this is the west side. This is the north. On the north side would be the Antonia Fortress. So what it's saying here, sorry. What it's saying here is, I'm trying to get, move this. Okay. Maybe you don't see it, but I see it. Okay. So the yellow area is what's called the square Temple Mount. This is what's 500 by 500 cubits. This can never, ever, ever change. Remember, this is west, this is east, this is north, this is south. What's in the blue was added by the Hasmoneans, and the rest of it, which is that beige colored, that tan color, that was added by Herod. Around these 500 areas, you could do changes, but within the 500 by 500, nothing could be changed. So when Yeshua got mad with the people, with the merchants that were stealing from, they were corrupt, and they were exchanging money with higher interest rate and all these things, it was outside these 500 cubits by 500, right? Because this is very, very holy. This is the most holy area within the Temple Mount. So again, Yeshua was on these, around these areas. Okay, so this would be what today is the Kotel, or the Western Wall. So again, Yeshua, anytime he went into the temple per se, the temple grounds, the court of the women to teach, he had to do a mikvah. He had to follow the protocol every time he went in there. So in reference to the Torah portion itself, what we have is that last week in the Torah portion, Vayikra, this was an instruction that was given to the people. The instruction in Vayikra is mainly to the whole nation of Israel, to the people, with the purpose of what? Teaching them how to come close, yakriv, with a korban or an offering to God. If anyone wanted to come into the presence of the Lord, into his house, into his sacred space, he was giving a way of doing it, and it was through a korban or an offering. While in this Torah portion, Tzav, it has to do with the teachings, or to the priesthood itself. So Tzav means command. So now here Moses is commanding the priest in reference to the offerings. And what he's teaching the priest is about the service, the avodah of the offerings, all the protocol related to all the offerings, on how they were to supervise these offerings and their rights and responsibilities with the offerings. And for the priest, the classification of the offerings was different than it was from the people, because the classification of the offerings to the priests were in reference to the grade of holiness of those offerings, which were divided among most holy and less holy. Among the most holy offerings, we have the olah, which is the burnt offering. We have the mincha, which is the grain or the flour offering. We have the chatat, which is translated the sin offering, but like I've said before, it should have been translated purification offering, because it's really not about sin, it's about purification. And then we have the asham offering, which is it's been called the guilt or retribution offering. So these are the most holy. And so they're treated in a different manner than the less holy. And again, the less holy, the one that was considered less holy, was the shelamim offering, which was the fellowship offering. And it was also a thanksgiving offering. And this is the offering from which the person that offers it is allowed to eat of it and share it with his family or friends. Now, again, in this chapter, in this Torah portion, it's advised again, it's told again, commanded again, that no one, absolutely no one, could eat of the fat that was designated for Hashem, or any blood. Remember, there was a specific fat of the animal that always had to be burnt, and that belonged to the Lord. It was an aroma, smelling aroma, a good aroma for the Lord. And they also mention on this Torah portion that the fire on the altar is Esh Tamid. Esh Tamid means that it's continual. It can never, ever, ever go out. It was always have to be burning. Now the Esh Tamid, the eternal fire, there were 3 fires on the altar. In the southeast corner of the altar was a fire called the Gadol, which means large or great or big. And this was the largest wood pyre for all the burnt offerings, the olot. Any offering that was a burnt offering went on this large wood pyre, so where this fire was burning. This was the largest one. Then there was a second one called the second on the southwest corner of the altar. And this wood pyre from here was the only place that you could take burning coals to the altar of incense to do the ceremony, the ritual of the incense. You could not take coals from the Gadol. You had to take it from here for the altar of incense. And then there was a smaller wood pyre called Katan. Katan means small. And this one was on the north side of the altar, or it could be placed any other area within the altar. And so this was the smallest fire, and it was always burning. That's why it's called Esh Tamid, fire, continual or eternal fire, from where the menorah could only be lit. The same way that the altar of incense, the burning coals can only be taken from this second pile, for the menorah, to light the menorah, could be only taken from this small wood pyre. Why? Because according to the commentaries, what they say is, and we will read about this in next Torah portion, after everything is set up and the priests have been consecrated and they start ministering in the tabernacle, that it says that a fire from God, from heaven, came down and lit up the altar to consume the burnt offering. And so it is that fire that since that moment was kept burning all the way to the second temple. So this is called the Esh Tamid. So this fire could never go out. Well, at least that was the purpose. At least not the second temple. I make a correction there. During the time that the tabernacle was standing, the fire that existed, that was called the Esh Tamid, was the original fire that came down from heaven that lit up the altar for the first time. So that's why it was important to keep it always burning. But then there was a fourth wood pyre that was burned during the time when the festival of Yom Kippur was celebrated. Only on Yom Kippur were they allowed to have an extra fire burning, and that was for the purpose of lighting the altar of incense to do the ceremony of incense, the ritual of incense associated with the Yom Kippur service. And here, this is just to show you, this is the south. Remember, the ramp is always on the south side of the altar. This is the north, where they slaughtered the animals. And here is what's called tapuach. Tapuach is where they put all the ashes. Here we have the large wood pile, or the gadol, on the southeastern side of the altar. Here we have the second wood pile, which is for the incense. Part of the coals were used for the incense, and this is in the southwest side of the altar. And then we have here towards the north the Esh Tamid. This was the smallest wood pile, and from here this fire could never, ever, ever be put out. It was always to be burning, continually burning. And here's another diagram showing here the priest. Remember, only the priests are allowed to do this part of the service. Here again, the northern part, this is the place where they slaughter the animals. Here's the ramp towards the south. Here we have the 3 wood piles, the larger one for all the burnt offerings. This one was to use to ignite the incense on the altar of incense. And this one was the Esh Tamid that was continually burning. Here we have the ashes. Here we have the priest, and if you correlate the size of the priest with the altar, this thing was huge. This place was huge. And here we have them throwing on the large wood pile the fire for the burnt offerings, the pieces of the animals that were being offered. Now, one of the things is that these priests had to be very skillful in throwing these parts of the offering onto the fire, because if it missed and they went outside the fire, they were invalidated. So these guys were excellent pitchers. I guess pitchers, what you call them? I don't know. The way they were able to throw the parts of the animals into the largest wood pile of the fire to be burned. And if you notice, all of them are using their right hand, because no one, even if they were left-handed, they had to do all the services, all the ministering of the services of the temple with their right hand. And what I wanted to show here is, it's a little bit blurry, but I just want you to notice this red line on the altar, because this red line divided the altar in upper and lower. So why? Because there were certain offerings where the blood of that offering had to be splashed on above the red line, and others had to be, the blood had to be splashed below the red line, depending on the offering. And if this was done the wrong way, what had to be on top went to the bottom, or what had to go to the bottom went up to the top, that offering could be invalidated. So all this requires very detailed protocol on how to perform all the services that were required. And remember, these are commandments given by God. This is something that He Himself ordered. Of course, all these other extra information, where you can find it, because the Bible doesn't give you all the details, is in the Mishnah. The different books of the Mishnah relate to different offerings. What I'm showing here is what's called the mishchat. The mishchat is comes from the word mashach, which should sound familiar. It's from where we get Mashiach. So mishchat was the gift portions that were given to the priests that were handling the offerings. It was a way of paying them for their service, because it was called mishchat, which in this case, instead of meaning anointing, it was that these were gifts of glory and honor to the priest. Why? Because these were offerings that the animal was offered to the Lord, but the Lord shares His offering with the priest. So the part that's called the breast of the animal, and what's called here the haunch, which is really the back leg, the right back leg, was given to the priest that was ministering. And this is part of the wave offering. So they wave these parts of the animal with the grain or the unleavened bread, and they didn't burn these pieces. They took them and then they ate them. It was something, it was the gift for the priest on behalf of the Lord. And so that was a way to pay for their work. Of course, if these pieces of meat were a lot, the priest was allowed to share it with the other priests. Because this is part of the most holy offerings, the priest could not share this meat with his family. It had to be with the other priests, because they're holy and only the priest could eat of it. Remember that only when it was a shelamim offering could they share it with their family and friends. Chapter 8 of this Torah portion has to deals with the consecration of the priest, because remember that in the last Torah portion we had the tabernacle was completely erected, everything was in place to be put into function, into service. But before doing that, everything had to be consecrated, especially the priesthood. So Moses consecrates the priest. And why has to be a consecration and ordination of the priest? Because they are going to minister as messengers of God and representatives of the people. They're messengers of God in the sense that they bring the word of the Lord, the Torah. They explain the Torah to the people. They taught the Torah to the people. Any word that came from the Lord to the priest was given to the people. They were the messengers of God, but they were also representatives of the people. Why? Because the priests were the ones that manipulated the blood of the offerings and did all the service of the offering, the avodah, on behalf of the people when they came to present these things to the Lord. So Moses brings the holy garments, the holy anointing oil, a bull as a sin or purification offering, 2 rams, of which one of them is going to be offered as a burnt offering, and the other one is for the ordination of the priest, along with a basket of unleavened bread. And the congregation is called to be witnesses. And congregation in the Hebrew is edah, edah. And the thing about the congregation, it was that it was not the whole nation of Israel, but at least the elders and the chiefs of the tribes, of families. In other words, the higher ranking people within the society, within the community, were the ones that were going to be witnesses of this ordination or consecration of the priest. So we have that the Mishkan, all the furniture, all the utensils, the priests were all with all their holy garments. Everything had to be anointed with oil. And remember that the oil they're using is the oil that the Lord himself gave the recipe for. The holy oil that no one else could use it or prepare for anything else except for the purpose for which God said it had to be done. Now, the interesting thing about this, the ceremony of consecration, of ordination of the priesthood had to be for 7 days. And like we have said many times, that the number 7 is associated with creation. It's associated with the temple. It's associated with coronation. It's associated with kedusha, sanctification. So that's why for 7 days, the priest had to be going through this process of ordination, of this ritual, of being separated or consecrated for the service to the Lord. And they could not leave the Mishkan for those 7 days. They had to be there all this time. So this ordination required 2 basic things, oil and blood. Why? Because these things would elevate the status of the priest. And the elevation of status is not a social status. Remember that with God, there are no social classes. Everyone is equal. The status is in reference to holiness. Like I said before, remember that Israel has a grade of holiness. The Levites have a higher grade of holiness than the other tribes. Within the Levites, the priests have a higher grade of holiness than the Levites. And within the priesthood themselves, the high priest has even a higher grade of holiness. So this has to do with status of holiness. They're elevated. And the purpose of this is to, when everything is anointed with oil, is to unite the Mishkan, everything that's in the Mishkan, especially the altar that's outside in the court, to the priest. So this is uniting them. Remember that the Mishkan represents the presence of God, his sacred space, and the priests are his ministers, his messengers, the representatives of the people. So with the second ram, which is the ram of ordination, Moses had to kill the ram, and the blood of that ram was used to really, this is what really consecrates or does the ordination of the priesthood. He had to put blood on the right ear of both Aaron and his sons, right? Why? Because the ear represents hearing, listening, shema, shomer, to guard, to keep, to do whatever the Lord commanded. Blood on the right thumb. Why? Because the thumb of the right hand represented the avodah, or the service, the actions of righteousness, which is doing the mitzvot, the commandments. Blood on the right toe. Why? Because it has to do with halacha, with derech. Halacha is the way of walking, while derech is the way. And what is the way? The way of the Lord, the way he commands his priest to walk in his presence. The ceremony was for 7 days, and which meant that they had to eat in the presence of God. Why? Because remember that part of the commandments of the covenant has to do with eating a meal. And so here they were eating, on these 7 days they were eating, because this has to do with the priesthood covenant, the establishment of the priesthood covenant. And also they, for being guards of the entrance of the Mishkan. Now, of course, if they're there for 7 days and 7 nights, that doesn't mean they did not sleep, but they had to do shifts. Aaron and his sons had to do shifts during these 7 nights to keep guard of the entrance of the tabernacle. Why? Because of the holiness, the grade of holiness within this area. The priests were the ones in charge of making sure that that holiness was not broken, that no one trespassed the restrictions of the areas of this holiness. And here what we're seeing is the garments of the high priest. Again, his hat, his turban with the with his crown that said, Holy unto Hashem. We have the breastplate, we have the robe and the tunic. Remember that the pomegranates and the bells were at the bottom of the robe. And this is what the regular priest, those that were not the high priest, wore. They had everything is in linen. That they had their linen turban, their tunic, their belt. And here what we're seeing is Moses anointing with blood, with the blood of the ram or nation. Aaron, here he's anointing the ear. Remember that part of that blood had to go on the altar. Why? Because the purpose is uniting the altar with the priesthood. The altar represents the Lord and the priesthood in service of the Lord. And as for Shabbat Hagadol, again, if you read Malachi, the book of Malachi is a message of restoration. And why is this read right before Passover? Because that's what Passover is about. Passover is about restoration, the restoration of a people from bondage, from enslavement to a wrong king, a false king, bringing them back to the right king, or the faithful king, the king of Israel. It is also a message of hope. Why? Because Passover was the hope of going to the promised land. And also a message of the Messiah, who's the Redeemer, the Messiah that redeems the people of Israel from enslavement, from being away in exile from their king. And it's the book of Malachi that speaks about the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. So this is why it's called Shabbat Hagadol. It's the great Sabbath right before Passover, because these are the themes that Malachi speaks about, and it has to do with Passover. And we'll be speaking about Passover, God willing, in the next week. So with that, let's go to the Torah portion for a little bit to go over that. If you could please go to chapter 6, verse 8. If you have your Bible with you, chapter 6, verse 8. It says, Then Hashem spoke to Moses, saying, Command, Tzav, Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the law of the burnt offering, or the Torah of the burnt offering. The burnt offering shall be on the hearth upon the altar all night until morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it. And the priest shall put on his linen garment, and his linen trousers he shall put on his body, and take up the ashes of the burnt offering which the fire has consumed on the altar, and he shall put them beside the altar. Remember the picture that I showed you on the altar where you had the pile of ashes and all the different fires. So he's speaking about the big fire, the Gadol fire, where these burnt offerings were to go upon. Verse 11, Then he shall take off his garments, put on other garments, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. And the fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it. It shall not be put out. And the priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and lay the burnt offering in order on it, and he shall burn on it the fat of the peace offerings, or the shalomim. A fire shall always be burning on the altar. It shall never go out. So what does that tell us today? Today there is no temple. Today no offerings are being done because there's no temple. Of course, that fire right now does not exist. But for us, that fire is the fire of the Holy Spirit within us. That fire that is maintained, lit through Messiah Yeshua. So if we are called ourselves the temple of the living God, we have to understand these things in the Torah in reference to the real temple, because it also pertains to us. Our purpose as ministers of the Lord, as representatives and messengers of the Lord, have to make sure that that fire of the living God, of the Holy Spirit, is lit always within us. And how do we do that? How do we keep that lit? How do we keep that fire burning? Through doing his commandments, his mitzvah, studying the Torah, doing acts of righteousness and justice, doing exactly like Messiah did. Because if Messiah followed the protocol of the temple, how much more do we have to do the same thing especially when we ourselves call ourselves the temple of the living God. And then in verse 14 through verse 23, it's speaking about the grain offering or the mincha. Now remember that in terms of holiness, these first four offerings, which is the burnt offering, the mincha, the grain offering, and the sin offering, and the trespass offering, which is the asham, and the chatat, all these are considered most holy. And part of the most holy, some of these offerings, the priests had to participate of them by eating of them. That was part of the ritual. And so except for the burnt offering, which had to be completely burnt. But the mincha, which was the flour, the grain, the sin offering, and the trespass or sham offering, the priest had to participate of that by eating part of the meat of those animals. And in terms of the grain offering, it says in verse 14, this is the law or the Torah of the grain offering, the mincha. The sons of Aaron shall offer it on the altar before the Lord. He shall take from it his handful of fine flour of the grain offering with its oil and all the frankincense which is on the grain offering, and shall burn it on the altar for sweet aroma as a memorial to the Lord. And the remainder, because remember, again, in other places it mentions exactly how much grain they had to bring. Whatever was left over, because he only takes a handful, and that is burnt as a burnt offering. The rest of it, Aaron and his sons had to eat of it. And if it was too much, then he had to share it with the other priests, because only the priests could eat of this grain, because it was one of the most holy, considered a most holy offering. And it had to be eaten in a holy place. In the court of the tabernacle of meeting, they shall eat it. So it was within the sanctuary area per se. They could not go out of the court of the sanctuary to eat this. Why? Because it was a most holy offering. Different from the shelamim, which has a lesser grade of holiness. This could be eaten outside the temple, anywhere within the gates or the walls of Jerusalem. It could not be eaten outside of Jerusalem. It could be eaten within Jerusalem. Remember, the Passover is a shelamim offering. So that meant that the people that ate that shelamim offering, that Passover during the time of the temple, had to eat it within the walls of Jerusalem. And when you read the Mishnah that talks about these things, it tells you that if you ate it outside the walls of Jerusalem, you invalidated that offering. So there was a lot of restrictions. Why? Because it's based on the grade of holiness of the offering, of the people, of the place. So all these details, you'll find them in the Mishnah. And there was also a grain offering that was offered by the high priest. For example, while they were being ordained, the high priest every day in the morning and in the evening had to bring a grain offering. That was part of the protocol of being ordained. But after ordination, every single day, the high priest always had to bring a grain offering. But his grain offering, instead of being shared with the rest of the priests, that one was completely burned. In verses 24 through 30 is the law or the Torah of the sin offering. And again, it's the same thing in terms of, like we read last time, the protocol doesn't change. It says the same thing. It says in verse 25, speak to Aaron, to his son, saying, this is the Torah of the sin offering or the purification offering. In the place where the burnt offering is killed, the sin offering shall be killed before Hashem. It is most holy. Now, something that maybe some people don't notice is that the same place where the burnt offering, remember that the burnt offering, the mincha, which is the grain offering, the burnt offering, and the shelamim, or the peace offerings, these were all voluntary. They have nothing to do with sin. This was all voluntary, either because you were grateful, either because you had a petition before the Lord, or you just simply wanted to approach him and you brought one of these offerings. The thing about this is that in the same place that you bring a burnt offering, that in the same place that the burnt offering was burned, so was the sin offering. What does that mean? That if you were bringing a sin offering, only God and you and the priest knew that it was a sin offering. Okay? Why? Because it was being burned in the same place that the burnt offering. So no one outside of you, of the priest and of God, knew that you were bringing a sin offering. So God is so gracious not to cause you shame that you're bringing a sin offering in the same area, in the same place that the burnt offering was burnt, so was the sin offering. So no one could say, oh, look at this, Nereida's bringing a sin offering. Who knows what she did? So that's the mercy and the grace of our King, that in the same place, both offerings are burned in the same area. And so it says, and there were also restrictions on how long you could have this meat and eat it. There were certain, depending on the offering, some offering, the meat of that offering had to be eaten within 24 hours, and some of them could be eaten within 2 days. If anything was left for a third day, that meat that was left over for a third day had to be completely burned. No one could eat of it. If you ate of it, it's a prohibition. You cannot eat of meat on the third day, a leftover of a third day. If you ate of it, you will be committing what's called karet. Karet, again, is a judgment of God, which could be premature death. In chapter 7, talks about the Asham offering, or the trespass offering, or the guilt offering, or the retribution offering. Any of these words could be used for that offering. And again, it has to do with that there's different reasons for bringing these. But remember, this is in reference to the priest. Now, these offerings, the skin of that animal that was an asham or a guilt offering belonged to the priest that was ministering. You also have to remember that the Lord provided for the priests as they were offering. It was part of their payment. In verses 11 through 21, it talks about the shelamim. And again, the shelamim offering, which is also called the peace offering or the fellowship offering. This was the only offering of which the person that brought it could eat of it. So the shelamim offering was divided among three. All the fat that belonged to the Lord was burnt for the Lord. The breast and the hind leg, the right hind leg of the animal, was given to the priest. And then the rest of the animal was given back to the person that brought the offering, so they can eat of it with their family and their friends. So that's why it's called a fellowship offering or a peace offering, because it was something that you could share. Remember that this one had a less grade of holiness than the other ones. And so that's what it's explaining here about that one. And then in verses 22 through 27, it again talks about that no one could eat the fat that was designated for the Lord. And remember that the fat that it's talking about is the fat that covers the organs, the 2 kidneys, the diaphragm that covers the liver, and then if it was a goat or a sheep that had what's called a fat tail, the fat of that tail. Okay, that doesn't mean that the rest of the fat of the animal could not be eaten. It's just that these in particular could not be eaten by anyone, because these had to be offered to the Lord. And then, of course, of blood, no one could eat blood. No one, of any kind of offering or of any animal, whether the animal was clean or unclean or whatever. No one can eat the blood of any animal. And then verses 28 through 38 speak about the portions that were always to be given to the priest that offered that offering. Again, it is a mishchat, which meant that this animal had been offered to the Lord, but the Lord shares his portions by giving to the priest the breast and the hind leg as a payment. Why? Because, in other words, the Lord is sharing a meal with the priesthood, and it's a form of paying them, and they would eat this meat among themselves or with the other priest, the priest that was offering, making the offering, and the other priest within the priesthood. Because remember, if it's an offering that is most holy, it could be eaten only by the priest. And then in chapter 8, it talks about, like we had said, what Moses brought to have the priesthood ordained and consecrated, separated unto the Lord. They had a bull, they had the rams, they had the garments. Everything had to be anointed with oil. And also they had to be sprinkled with both oil and blood. Why? Because this elevates the status of holiness of the priesthood and of the whole tabernacle, the whole Mishkan. Because the purpose is uniting everything within the tabernacle with the priest, especially the altar. So all these things had to be sanctified, had to be separated for service unto the Lord and only unto the Lord. And the people that are going to be ministering or doing the service of the whole tabernacle or of the whole temple were the priests. So in other places, they call this indexing, where with the blood, you're connecting everything to the priest. You're connecting the altar. You're connecting the holy place, the Holy of Holies, all the utensils, everything that was used, all the garments. So this is it in a way, not only literally, but spiritually is connecting everything to the priesthood. That's why it's also a covenant, an eternal covenant that the Lord made with the priest. So my understanding, my opinion is that when Yeshua comes to rule and reign from Jerusalem, the third temple, there will be offerings again, but not for sin. There will be offerings, the voluntary offerings, which would be the burnt offering, the mincha, and the shalomim. There won't be offerings for sin, because Yeshua already redeemed us from that. But I think, and it's my opinion, that once that 1,000 years of Yeshua reigning finish, remember that we'll be going into the phase of eternity. And what's called the New Jerusalem that'll be coming from heaven is really the temple that's in the heavens, the heavenly temple. And that temple is going to come down onto the earth. But I don't think that from that moment on, there will be any more offerings. Why? Because again, God will be living in the midst of his people in a visible way. So therefore, there won't be no need of more offerings. Why? Because they'll be returning back to the time of Eden, to the time of when God was in the midst of Adam and Eve. So there's no need for offerings. Remember that the offering started once Adam and Eve were exiled from Eden. Why? Because God always made a way for mankind to approach him until the coming of Yeshua, when he fulfilled completely, being able to come into the presence of God, being completely purified of our moral and ritual impurities from the heart, from the inside out. Okay? So again, the purpose of all this, God making a way for us to approach him. There's a protocol. If the kings of the earth have a protocol on when you go to see them or to meet them, if the Queen of England has a protocol when you go to visit her, if the Pope has a protocol when you go to visit him, how much more our King, the creator of the universe, has a protocol to approach him. Today, there's no temple and there's no offerings, but our greatest offering is Yeshua. So it is through Yeshua that we approach our Heavenly Father. It is through Yeshua. He is the perfect offering that we can come to him and present ourselves. So, but again, there's a way of doing things. There is a process of sanctification. There's a process of doing, why? Because we're approaching a holy God. We're approaching a sacred space. That's why Shabbat is so important, because Shabbat, we enter into a dimension of holiness. We enter into a time that is outside of time. We enter into a time of sacredness, of holiness, to be in the presence of God. So all these things, the book of Leviticus really is to teach us about holiness. And even though a lot of these things cannot be done because there's no temple, we can't do these offerings. And really, none of us are used to these things. We live in a completely different culture from the time of the tabernacle and the temple. But still, the bottom line, the principle is teaching us that if our God is holy, he says we need to be holy like he is holy. And holiness means separation. We need to separate ourselves from everything else that's not him. And at this time, we're approaching Passover, and it's time we're going through these times of the coronavirus where everybody's at home. Most everybody's at home. We've been basically isolated socially. And I think what we should see about this, that this is a time to we've been separated unto the Lord for such a time as this. This is a time to be in his presence, be in prayer, be in studying his word, taking this opportunity to disconnect from all the things that are not him and get closer to him. So again, this is the way I see it, and this is the way I understand it. So let us take advantage of this time to sit with our family members together, prayer and studying the word and getting closer to our King, because the bottom line is he is sovereign, he's on the throne, and that's what only matters. Our trust is in him. And so we need to show those that do not know him, we need to show them the way of holiness. We need to show them a way to approach our King, and that way is through Messiah Yeshua. So we're going to take a time for questions.